talk, let's go ahead and get started with today's virtual mind walk. First of all, I want to thank our partners from the Central Coast State Parks Association for their help putting together these very important online lectures that we are so excited we can share with our volunteers and the public. And it's something we've been doing now in San Luis Obispo Coast District virtual mind walk offerings since the March 2020. So for a little over a year, we've been offering these great lectures. And I think this is the second time that we've welcomed today's presenter into our virtual mind walk series. So I'm so excited to introduce today's speaker. I just saw something come through the chat, so I'm going to go ahead.
It was just me asking if you wanted to record.
Oh, yes. So I am recording now. I'm not sure if you can see that, but it is absolutely recording.
Okay.
And that's a really good point because we are going to post this recording on our YouTube channel. So if you are not currently following the San Luis Obispo Coast District YouTube channel, please check it out. There's lots of amazing content on there, including all of our virtual mind walk series, lecture series videos. So following this presentation, this video will be edited and uploaded to the channel for future viewing. So I'm so excited to welcome back our guest presenter today. So today we have Dr. Heather Liwanag, and she is an associate professor of biology at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She earned a BS in biology from the University of California, San Diego, and a Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is a comparative physiologist, which means that she studies how animals work and often make comparisons across different animal groups. She has been studying marine mammals, including pinnipeds, seals and sea lions, dolphins and sea otters for 19 years. She has also studied sea turtles and terrestrial lizard species. Much of her research has focused on thermoregulation, the regulation of body temperature, and energetics metabolic rates. More recently, her lab has been studying the population of dynamics of the northern elephant seal population at Piedras Blancas, San Simeon, California. Thank you and welcome, Heather. We're so excited to have you today. It's all you.
Thanks, Robin, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to share some information with you about the effects of human disturbance on marine mammals. So let's get started. So just to bring us all on the same page, I wanted to point out some of the local marine mammals that we find off the California coast. So here are some examples of cetaceans, so whales and dolphins that we might see here. So we have bottlenose dolphins, we have harbor porpoises, we have common dolphins that are relatively common to see off our coast. Very occasionally, we might see some orcas out there. And of course, most of you probably know that we frequently can see gray whales and humpbacks off our coast, especially here in the Central Coast. And then pinnipeds that we might see around here in California include harbor seals, northern elephant seals, which Robin just mentioned, California sea lions, and typically offshore we can see northern fur seals. They do breed in the Channel Islands, but we don't often see them hauling out on our coast. And of course, our furry friend, the sea otter, this is the southern sea otter, and it is a remnant population in California, and we're trying to restore that population to hopefully its previous glory of basically being all up and down the west coast of the US. Okay, so today's talk is about the effects of human disturbance, and I have a picture here of one of the national marine fisheries signs that are posted out in places where you can view marine mammals to remind folks that marine mammals are federally protected in the United States, and that's because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, which made it illegal to take marine mammals without a permit. And so I wanted to explain what a take is. Any sort of disturbance really to that marine mammal. So harassment, feeding them, hunting them, capturing, collecting them, killing them, of course, all of those count as takes. We're also not allowed to trade any parts of marine mammals that were collected from the United States, again, without a permit. Those of us who do research can sometimes get permission, but we do need permits in order to get parts to work with in the laboratory. And a take by the definition of the National Marine Fisheries Service is causing the animal to move at least a body length because of your behavior. However, this only protects marine mammals in US waters. So this is a federal law, and it does protect the marine mammals that we have, but a lot of these mammals migrate, and when they do, if they're outside of our waters, they're not necessarily protected. And additionally, species that are not in our waters would not be protected by this law. So this is protecting certainly the animals off of our coast in California, but it doesn't necessarily protect animals elsewhere in the world. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the more observable effects of human disturbance before getting into some of the ones that many folks don't necessarily think about because they're not quite as visible to us. So one of the reasons that the Marine Mammal Protection Act was put into effect was that we were really devastating a lot of marine mammal populations through hunting. And we hunted animals for their blubber to get oil from that for lamps and things like that. And for the furry ones like otters and fur seals, they were hunted for their fur, which made really great clothing and warm things for people to wear. And in certain areas, these animals were also hunted for food. And so this is no longer allowed except with certain permission for tribes within the United States, but it still occurs in neighboring countries such as Canada. So I did find that you can get harp seal oil supplements on Amazon right now for your omega-3s. And of course, they do sell seal skin products there as well. And it's just, they have different laws, and it is not just the indigenous peoples who are allowed to hunt harp seals, but I think it's a certain age class that's allowed to be hunted there. And there is a certain, as with most animals that are hunted there, it's now regulated in terms of number. But the point is that this still does happen throughout the world. So not allowed in the United States at all, but it does occur, and it's something we need to think about when populations cross borders, because these animals don't really care about our maps. But another issue that happens here as well as in other countries is interactions with fisheries, right? The fisheries are extremely important for our livelihood, especially in coastal communities. And of course, it's extremely important for these animals that are feeding on the fish. And initially, one way to look at this is we see a loss. We're just directly competing with these animals for their food. And sometimes we see their habitats disrupted by certain fishing methods. But we also see a lot of animals getting entangled in gear, and sometimes, and even here, intentional harm. So this picture on the bottom left here is called a seal bomb, and you can see that even says California. So sometimes fishermen get permits to put these little mini explosives along their fishing gear. The idea is to scare particularly sea lions away from the fishing gear so that they leave the catch alone. But unfortunately, sometimes that can have really devastating effects, because especially the juvenile sea lions are curious. They don't really understand what that is, and they will investigate with their mouths. And if it goes off, then it breaks their jaw and they starve to death. So unfortunately, that's a pretty common thing to see in animals that come in for necropsy, which is an animal autopsy, where you see this broken jaw and an emaciated animal that's probably from a seal bomb. And then thankfully less frequent, but pretty devastating when they happen. We have oil spills that happen off the coast. And this is a picture of an oiled otter from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was quite a while ago, but taught us a lot about how to care for oiled animals. And this is especially problematic for the animals that rely on their fur. So that includes sea otters and fur seals, but it can also be problematic for the other marine mammals just because the oil itself is toxic and can get into their bodies and cause them harm. It's bad for seabirds as well. I know that's not the topic here, but similar for seabirds with the furred critters. Okay, but now let's get into some of those hidden effects. So we know that pollution is an issue in the ocean, And one of the ones that we don't see as much information about in the media are these heavy metals and organic pollutants that we see in the runoff from agricultural industries. And the issue with these types of pollutants is they have sort of two ways in which they get magnified in the bodies of marine mammals in particular. So the first is called bioaccumulation, which I have a little diagram of here, which essentially means that the longer that these pollutants are present in the environment, the more that they accumulate over time. Because if you have these fish and they're feeding in this environment, they're just going to be accumulating this pollutant. And in particular, these heavy metals and these organic pollutants tend to kind of gather in certain tissues of the animals and stay there. And so they will accumulate as the animal gets older, then it has more of that pollutant in its body as it ages, simply due to time. But there's an additional factor with what we call trophic level, which is the higher up essentially on the food web or food chain, if you think of it that way, that an animal is, the more likely it's going to accumulate more of those pollutants, because we see them magnified as we go up in the different trophic levels. So you have these fish that are just feeding on the little plankton and they accumulate certain levels. And then you have a sea lion eating those fish and you'll see about an order of magnitude increase. So we're talking at least 10 times more percentage-wise of this pollutant in the predator compared to the prey. And so that keeps going on up when you have things that eat seals as well. So that's called biomagnification. And these are one of those hidden things that in particular, we don't always see the effects of this immediately when it happens, because as I mentioned, a lot of these pollutants will hang out in certain tissues. And in particular for marine mammals, some of them are lipid soluble. So they sort of hang out in the blubber for these animals. And you'll see them accumulate in the blubber in pretty high levels. And then it doesn't really come out and affect the animal so much until the animal is in a state where it is fasting, and now it has to mobilize those blubber stores and release those lipids into the blood. And now you get these pollutants circulating at levels all of a sudden, right? Because they were concentrated in the blubber before, and now they're released out into the body, and that's where you start to see those effects. And so this is still an area of active research where people are trying to understand the effects of these pollutants on these animals. But one thing we know is that they accumulate both over time and more so in the predators than in the prey. So a current active area of research is looking at microplastics, which we know are a huge deal at the moment. It's something that we've started to think about more. Microplastics refers to extremely small plastic particles. So here's a photo to illustrate that. These things that get broken down because of mechanical movement in the ocean over time. So these plastics get tumbled and you get little tiny pieces that come off. And even the small marine life can eat these things. And then again, the predators eat these smaller, say, filter feeders and start gathering these plastics in them. And so this is a picture of an article from 2019 saying that in every single marine mammal that they found in this study for the UK, there were microplastics in every single one of them. And of course, this is a great sort of click-grabbing headline for people to read it. Keep in mind that 5.5 of these tiny little particles in the guts is probably not going to cause a huge problem for these animals. So this isn't to say that this is an immediate and scary problem, but the issue is that if it's found in every single animal, it means that this is out there, and this is something we need to think about and start studying to try to prevent it from getting to the levels where we're going to see harm in these animals. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some of the nitty-gritty of the effects of our disturbance on marine mammals. So a little outline for the specific topics that I want to dive a little bit deeper into. So we're going to talk a little bit about stress. We're going to talk about how disturbance can cost these animals energy and the risk of mother-pup separation in some of these animals, because they are mammals. We have these moms that are going to be nursing their babies for a certain amount of time, and separating them during that time can be an issue. So before we get into the specifics of that, I wanted to play just a short video. Thank you to Kathy Curtis for sharing this. So this is a disturbance of a male elephant seal at Hearst State Beach. We have a couple of ladies checking out the seal. They're curious. They're trying to get his attention. If you notice, He's flipping sand, which can be a sign of stress in these animals. It's one of the things they do when they're stressed out. And then he had enough and he chased them away. But it took him some energy to lift up and tell them, hey, I'm done with this. And they're fine, thank goodness, but it could have been much worse. And then she walks right behind him and off she goes to go hiking. Okay, so why is it an issue when we're causing stress in these animals? Let's talk about that. So we're going to talk about stress due to handling, and by that I mean for research purposes, and then a little bit about how stress can affect the physiology and the behavior of these animals. I'm a physiologist myself, so I have handled marine mammals, and I want to point out that researchers are really interested in ensuring that we are not causing too much stress on these animals. And so here I'm just going to give you some titles, just a few examples of papers that have looked at the effects of research handling on the stress in these animals to get an understanding of how our activities are affecting the animals. And the point I'm trying to make is that researchers pay attention to this, and we care and think about how this affects future protocols as well. And when we apply for permits, we have to justify our sample sizes and justify every protocol we do to ensure that we minimize the stress that we're having on those animals. So we do think it's worth it, and I want to point that out, but I know, this is an important thing for folks to understand, that researchers are not just going out there and doing whatever the heck they want with these animals. And we think that what we're getting from being able to do this research is worth the risk of causing some stress in a small number of the animals in a population. So what are the positive impacts we get from this? One is that it informs conservation and management. And by management, I mean thinking about how to handle human and marine mammal interactions, or the land that the animals are using, or the oceans that the animals are using. And so there is a very famous example of a conservation win with this. It's not on our coast, but on the East Coast here. So the Bay of Fundy is a really interesting tidal area with a lot of ship traffic, and they also have right whales. And they were finding that these whales were getting a lot of ship strikes. And so they went ahead and tagged some of the whales to get a feel for the most important regions of the bay that the whales were using, and managed to just move the shipping lanes over. So here, I know it kind of looks like the whales are moving, but the whales here are in about the same area. This is their important foraging grounds, and this is the same area. But by moving the shipping lanes just a little bit over, we're still able to maintain the economic shipping that's super important for this area, but also reduce the ship strikes that are happening with these whales. So we had to have some of these animals tagged in order to know where they were going, but that information allowed us to prevent harm to the future of the population by moving the ships over. So aside from that, we also have organizations that handle the animals for health and rehabilitation, including the Marine Mammal Center, for which the primary hospital is in Sausalito, but we have a satellite hospital here in Morro Bay as well. And so we can learn things from these animals while they're in rehabilitation at these facilities. And some of the animals that I've studied were actually coming through the Marine Mammal Center, and I was able to learn a little bit about them before they got released. And so this gives us an opportunity to handle the animals in a situation in which they're already temporarily in captivity because they're needing to recover from some issue. And then we get to learn something from them and get them back out into the wild. And some of the things that we study, in particular with elephant seals, can be applied to human medicine, even from marine mammals. Elephant seals have been used for a lot of really interesting endocrine studies, including kidney function, and also things to do with apnea, because they do hold their breath for a very long time. So there are some really incredible applications to human medicine that we can learn from working with these animals as well. And my final takeaway from this that I want to share with you is that one of the things about this is we understand that we are causing some stress when we do this research, but we are working with a small number of animals in a very short period of time to learn this information, and then we apply that to the population as a whole, which is different from the chronic stress of public viewing of the same animals repeatedly in a very large area. So how does that affect these animals? Well, one of the issues with it is an increase in the hormone called cortisol. They are mammals, and this is the same hormone that we have that is associated with chronic stress. And so when an animal is stressed out, and that includes a human animal, then we see elevated levels of this hormone called cortisol. And one of the things that cortisol does is it suppresses the immune system, because in a stress situation, you don't want to be worried about getting sick. And really, the activation of your immune system is what causes you to feel sick. And so you could be infected with something, but your immune system is not going to activate as readily when there are high cortisol levels, because the stress response is to make it so that you're able to get through whatever this current stressor is. That gets prioritized over potentially, say, getting infected with a pathogen. And the problem with that is that allows the pathogen to potentially take over in a way that it wouldn't had you not had those elevated levels of cortisol. So essentially, it suppresses the immune system and can allow these animals to get infected in ways that they may not have, that their immune system would have responded to more readily had they had lower levels of this stress hormone. Another issue is that it takes these animals longer to heal, and in particular with marine mammals like the seals and sea lions that come onto shore periodically. Often one of the reasons they come to shore is to replenish what's going on with their skin. So seals in particular, when they're out there in the water and they're diving, they need to keep their surface temperature pretty close to the water temperature, because they're using blubber for insulation. And so their skin temperature is very cold, and cold cells do not divide very well. So they have to haul out in order to heal wounds from, say, a shark bite. And when they're hauled out, that enables them to warm up their skin. But if they have high levels of cortisol, that still can suppress the division rate of those cells, and it makes it take them longer to heal their wounds as well. And finally, again, we're talking about mammals. So these animals are pregnant. Honestly, the females are pregnant for much of the year, and elevated levels of cortisol can impact the health of their developing fetus when they are pregnant. So what about behavior? You may think about this, right? A lot of us have been stressed recently with this pandemic, and it tends to change the way that you do things. And that's true for marine mammals as well. It alters their natural behaviors. It impairs their thinking. They don't make decisions as well when they're stressed out. And it takes their attention away from the things that they need to be doing, whether that's resting or foraging or any of those other things. If the animal is diverting its attention to interacting with people, then it's not doing the things that it was originally there to do. And that wastes time and energy for these animals. And their energy budgets are sometimes extremely limited. And I'm going to talk about that in the next section. But that's something to think about, is we don't want to be taking away from their energy budget. Otters, for example, we like to say live paycheck to paycheck. So if any of you can relate to that, you don't want to waste any of that energy when you're living paycheck to paycheck. So take-home messages from this section. Public viewing can be really stressful for these animals, and that affects their physiology and behavior primarily in negative ways. And a reminder that researchers are aware of this. We're trained to minimize these effects, and we are very careful to limit the number of animals and the amount of time with which we work with animals to learn the information that we need to help conserve and manage their populations. So now let's talk about those energy costs. I want to orient you because I'm going to give you some graphs now. So in this graph, we have speed on the x-axis, and then we have body drag on the y-axis here. And so the take-home message from this graph is that when an animal is swimming, the amount of drag on its body increases with speed. And in general, it's kind of an exponential relationship between the speed that the animal's going and the amount of drag that the animal experiences. But another thing to take away from this picture, which is data for otters, is that the amount of drag is much higher all the way across when the animal is swimming at the surface than when it's just a couple of body lengths underneath the water, because there's something called wave drag, which comes from breaking the surface of the water repeatedly when you're at the surface, that increases the drag by these factors here. And so this dotted line represents the speeds at which an otter will typically swim on the surface. And then right when it gets about here, about 0.8 meters per second, they say, okay, if I want to go faster, I'm going to dive down a little bit so that I can reduce the drag on my body. And you don't see it going up about above this 4 or 5 newtons here. So this translates almost directly into how much it costs these animals to swim. So new graphs, but similar x-axis here. Both of these x-axes have to do with the speed of the animal, although this is for a land animal running and this is for a sea lion swimming. And then the y-axis here represents two different units, but they both represent metabolic rate, which is the energy cost to these animals. So take-home message from this slide is that metabolic rate increases with speed, and it does so differently when the animal is on land. So although this is for a mouse, this holds true across any mammals that are walking or running on land. The faster they go, there is a linear increase in the energetic cost, so their metabolic rate relative to the speed. And it's linear because all that the animal is fighting when it's going faster is gravity. So the faster you go, you need to overcome the gravity forces that are holding you back from that. And that's a linear relationship. But on the right-hand side, we have an exponential relationship, because when an animal is swimming, if you remember from the previous slide, the drag on that animal increases exponentially. And so the cost to that animal swimming also increases exponentially when the animal is swimming. So why does that matter? Let's look at this. These are similar data for dolphins, and it's the same thing here. And I know the units vary depending on the study, but this is still metabolism on the y-axis and speed on the x-axis. And you can see that exponential relationship that I described to you. And the black squares are actual data points for these animals. And what I want to point out is this orange shaded area is the preferred swimming speed for these dolphins, which is relatively fast. Okay, 1.5 to 2 meters per second is Olympic swimming speed level here for us, but this is cruising speed for a dolphin. And you can see that there's not a huge change in the cost to swimming right around here. They're right almost at this inflection point. But if we were to startle a dolphin and cause it to burst swim away, suddenly you have this exponential increase where here, if they're going 3 meters per second, we're almost doubling the cost here because of this exponential relationship, whereas here, a similar increase in speed was not causing such a big jump in the energy cost. So the point I'm trying to make here is that they prefer to be here. And when we ask them to swim faster, we're not only costing them more energy, but if they're swimming, we're costing them a lot more energy because there's an exponential relationship there. So as scientists, we translated this into something called the cost of transport, which is energy efficiency. So I'm taking you back to that sea lion graph I showed you before, still swim speed on the x-axis, metabolic rate on the y-axis. And cost of transport is not exactly the same as, say, fuel efficiency, but instead it's metabolic rate divided by speed. So essentially the slope of the graph. So I've put these little orange lines to show you that the steeper this orange line, because it's the slope of the graph, the less efficient the animal is at that moment. And so they're pretty efficient down here when they're swimming at 1 to 2 meters per second. When they start to have to speed up, you see these orange lines getting steeper and steeper. That is making it less efficient for this animal. So it is costing it a lot more energy to swim than it should be for these animals. And that is why they prefer to swim down here at these speeds where the slope, this cost of transport, is relatively low. So cost of transport not only changes with speed, but it also changes with body size. So in this graph, I have body mass on the x-axis and cost of transport. So now we're looking at those slopes on the y-axis. And it is on a log-log scale because this is being compared across animals of very different sizes. So this gray line here represents fish for comparison to our marine mammals. This is all for swimmers, by the way, in blue here. And then this gray line is our semi-aquatic mammals like sea otters and polar bears. And so a couple things that you can see is that all of these lines are sloping downward, so an inverse relationship here. This means that the cost of transport is higher for smaller animals compared to larger animals. So it costs more for smaller animals, pound for pound, to move than it does for these larger animals. And part of this has to do with them just being larger, but also their metabolic rates are proportionately lower when they're larger animals. But you might notice that we have these big jumps with these lines, right? A similarly sized fish is going to have a lower cost of transport than a killer whale. That's a big fish, but still. The difference here is endothermy, that because these are mammals, they are spending a lot of energy just maintaining their body temperature. And so this line would collapse if we didn't have this difference in how they maintain their internal environment. But because all of these mammals are endotherms, they use their own body metabolism to keep their body temperature warm. You have this jump in energy just for that. And otherwise, these would be similar lines. But then we get this other jump happening here because these are still marine mammals. But what we get here is the influence of that wave drag that I mentioned, because our semi-aquatic mammals are mostly swimming on the surface. And so when you have this wave drag happening, this less efficient swimming, then you get a big jump in the cost of transport for these animals. Okay, so let's zoom in on our sea otters, which are both small-bodied and mostly surface swimmers. Whoops. So we can see what's happening here. So we have different behaviors on the x-axis, and now we again have metabolic rate on the y-axis. And this is just showing you relative costs of different behaviors in a sea otter. So here's our resting rate. It's still pretty expensive to just be a sea otter, but diving doesn't cost them that much, and subsurface swimming is kind of similar for them. But you can see that surface swimming is one of the most expensive behaviors that these animals do. And typically when we disturb them, that's where they start, is they just try to swim away on the surface of the water. And that's a really expensive thing to ask an otter to do. They also have to groom themselves, and that is also energetically expensive and probably similar to surface swimming because it involves moving around on the surface of the water when they groom. But my point here is we're asking a lot of an otter who lives paycheck to paycheck when they have to move in response to our activities. So when does an otter move in response to our activities? I want to give a shout out to Heather Barrett, who allowed me to share some of these unpublished data with you on work that she's doing looking at human disturbance and sea otters. So x-axis here is distance from the otter to the disturbance that is happening. So say to the person. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at the relative magnitude of effect of this disturbance on the animal. So it goes from 0 to 1, 1 being the maximum amount of disturbance you could have caused that animal. And these different colored lines represent 3 different study sites, and then the black is the average in terms of how disturbed the otters were. So we have Monterey Bay, we have Morro Bay here, and then Moss Landing. So they're not geographically oriented here. I think they're alphabetical, maybe. I don't know what happened here. Anyways, that's what's happening. So you will notice there is some variation between sites, but the general idea is that the closer that the person gets to the otter, the more likely that otter is going to show signs of disturbance. And so if we just take the average, and we're being very conservative here, at 50 meters distant, we're going to have almost no effect on the animal. So the ideal would be stay, 50 meters away from these animals, which is, a good 150 feet. But that's what we want to do to completely avoid disturbance. And then the closer that you get to these animals, the more likely you are to disturb them, depending a little bit on the study site. Already at Monterey and Moss Landing, that's actually almost twice as high a probability of disturbing them at that average distance, and less so at Morro Bay, which I'll point out on the next graph as well. So Heather Barrett took it one step further to calculate, based on the metabolic rates of these animals that I showed you before, and then just saying, say we have these animals disturbed 6 times in a day. What would be the additional energetic cost to that otter if it had 6 disturbances? I will say, in Morro Bay, for example, the otters that are hanging out near the entrance and exit of Morro Bay are certainly getting disturbed more than 6 times a day, but we went with 6 disturbances and calculated the energetic cost of these disturbances to these animals. And so if we just zoom in for a second here, 20 meters disturbance, right? So if you look back, I'll jump back for a second. So we're here, we're 20 meters away from the otter, and we're in Monterey. So we're looking at how much these animals were getting disturbed. It would cost that otter 1/10 of a cancer crab, 9 clams, or 17 additional turban snails in food to make up for the energy lost due to dealing with the kinds of disturbance that happened. So that's for just 6 disturbances a day at a 20-meter distance, which is still a relatively reasonable distance. Now, you can see that because the otters at Morro Bay are more habituated to human presence, that they might not put as much energy into it, because you need to get a bit closer to them to cause a real disturbance in these animals. But there is a trade-off in that. So if they're habituated, that might be good in the sense that they're not going to be quite as concerned with that high level of disturbance that I mentioned in Morro Bay. But it comes at the cost of potentially less vigilance for predators. So if these animals are just not as worried about the activities going on around them, they might also not take as much notice when predators come around. And we have certainly seen an uptick in white shark issues with our otters in Morro Bay recently. And while I don't know that that's directly connected, it's something to think about, that these animals are habituated to humans, and that allows us to view them more closely, which is wonderful for us, but it may come at a cost to them in terms of, if they're not paying as much attention to disturbance around them, they're not going to notice when there's a real threat to them. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is just the sound that we make when we are around these animals, because our ships make noises, right? And here, this is from the International Whaling Commission. So this is about Antarctic blue whales here, and I apologize, I didn't make the circles on these. This is just from their website. But what you can see is that this y-axis, which isn't shown, is the frequency of sounds. And then this is a power spectrum. And so the warmer colors show where the sounds are stronger across these frequencies, and the cooler colors are where you're not getting as much of those sounds. And so up here, they're circling wind noise, and they're saying fish make noises in these higher frequencies, but our ship noises are relatively low frequency sounds. And those are the sounds that our larger whales use to communicate with one another. And so if you have a noisy ocean, you have animals for which their calls are being masked, meaning that they're going to have a harder time hearing one another, because the frequency at which they're trying to communicate matches the frequency at which we humans are making noise in their environment. So the response to that, and here's just a similar, now it's well labeled. We have frequency here on the y-axis. Here are the colors and showing you the decibel levels, so the loudness that's happening, and a little more labels here. So our large whales, our ship noise, which overlaps really nicely with our large whales. And then we have our humpbacks, which have a little bit higher frequency, but overlapping with things like wind and rain, and our fish are way up there. So if a whale has an issue with its calls being masked by human noise, it is either going to need to get louder, or it's going to need to shift its frequency to a different frequency, which has been shown to happen, but is far less likely. It's their voice, and they can't always change the tone of their voice. So it causes them stress in order to either be louder, and/or energy, I should say, in order to be louder, or to try to find a way to communicate over that noise. Imagine, if you're shouting over a loud concert when we're allowed to be at those again. You have to put energy into overcoming that noise that's similar in frequency to where you're trying to communicate. Okay, take-home messages from that little section. Moving costs these animals energy. So if we induce them to move when they hadn't expected to, especially if they're resting, then we are taking away from their energy budget. And this is especially problematic if we ask animals in the ocean to suddenly burst swim because of that exponential increase in cost when they have to swim faster. But it's also really problematic for our surface swimmers like our otters, because surface swimming is already more expensive. But even on land, asking an animal to move is going to cost it extra energy. And we saw that linear increase with speed, right? The faster they go, the more energy it costs them. And so this is a problematic thing when we cause disturbance that causes the animal to move away from where it was. In addition, our smaller animals move less efficiently, which I tried to show you with that cost of transport graph. So these smaller animals are already less efficient, and then we're asking them to move more. And it also costs these animals energy to counteract any noise that we introduce into their environment, whether that be in air or in the water, which are the ones that I showed you. Okay, last little section that I wanted to talk about was mother-pup separation. So true seals in particular tend to fast during nursing. Harbor seal moms will sometimes go and feed a little bit while they're nursing their pups, but elephant seal moms, for example, come onto shore, they give birth to their pup, they spend 4 weeks with that pup without eating or drinking and just basically protecting that pup. And they're using their own stored energy during that entire time to survive on their own and also to transfer their energy to that pup. And if we see, so they are energy limited, they are not able to go and get more energy. They have to live off of whatever they have stored from their previous foraging trip. But it's also time limited. Elephant seals only nurse for 4 weeks. So that's the only time they have to transfer all of that energy to their pup, at which point the pup spends a couple more months alone on the beach, living off of the energy stores that mom gave to it. So this picture that I'm showing you here is showing a weanling, so a recent weanling. That means it stopped nursing from mom pretty recently, and you can see it's nice and rotund. It has a nice blubber layer. And this one here is what we call a starveling, which is an animal that for whatever reason became separated from its mom too early. And it doesn't have enough energy stores to make it the rest of the way. They need to finish developing their physiology, and they do not have the option to go and eat right away. They have to still develop more before they're physically able to go forage. And so these animals, if they're separated from mom, really just don't have a great chance. I wanted to point out that harbor seal moms in particular are very skittish, and you don't necessarily have to see them in order for them to see you and stay away. And by this, I mean the seal will stay away if it sees you on or near the beach where its pup might be. And as I mentioned, sometimes harbor seal moms will go for really short nearby foraging trips and leave their pups on the beach. But if you're on the beach with that pup, mom will avoid coming back. And if you're there too long, she may just not come back at all. And this is where we end up with these pups getting abandoned with well-meaning people thinking they're protecting this pup. But in fact, what they're doing is preventing mom from coming back, because they are, I think rightly, since we used to hunt these animals, very afraid of people, very vigilant about it, and they tend to stay away. Now, similarly with whales, if the young calves get separated from mom, they're much more vulnerable to predation, particularly by killer whales who work really hard to separate them from mom. So if there's a whale watching situation in which the calf somehow gets separated from mom, especially if mom gets scared, that's going to make that calf more vulnerable. And similarly with sea otters, if the pup gets separated from mom, especially when they're really young, they're vulnerable to hypothermia, and they're not yet able to dive and forage on their own. So they really won't make it unless they get reunited with their mom, which does happen. We do have folks in California Department of Fish and Wildlife who have successfully reunited otter pups with their moms. But the goal, of course, is to, and they're not always separated from us, but the goal is to avoid that, because if we cause that separation, it's really bad news for these young pups that can't really survive on their own. Okay, so I like using this little Valentine from the Marine Mammal Center, but just reminders of what we're going to take away from this. It's always good to give our animals a wide berth. And one reminder that I like to tell people is that the seal pups don't necessarily belong in the water. A lot of well-meaning folk will come along and see these seal pups and think they're marine mammals, they belong in the ocean, but that is actually not the place for them when they're very young. And sometimes even the adult animals are coming out because maybe they're sick or trying to heal, and they don't belong in the water during those times either, but certainly not the pups. We don't want to try to return the pups to the water. A lot of times these pups need that time on land before they are ready to go be in the ocean. And if you see a pup by itself, the best thing to do is to try to let the mom come back. So give the animal space so that the mom feels safe enough to return. And that's true for otters as well. And or call the Marine Mammal Center and let them know about the situation so they can assess it and try to intervene if necessary. But oftentimes they will put a pup on watch for at least 24 hours to see if mom will return. Okay, so one more little video here of a disturbance. So I'll prime you here. Thankfully, these people at least have their dog on a leash. This is a little bit of an ad for having your dogs on a leash when you are on the beach with potentially marine mammals. But we have this juvenile elephant seal who's hauled out to molt. You can start to see the coat looks funny here because the animal is hauling out to warm up its skin so we can molt its fur and get a new fur layer growing in. And these folks are coming too close to the point that they disturb this animal, and in fact it startles their dog. So thank goodness the dog was at least restrained. 2 dogs. Right, so the seal sort of lunges and startles the dog, and it's because, you know, these folks did not give this animal enough space, and the animal felt threatened, especially by the presence of dogs, and it decided to react. So we've cost that animal some energy. These folks at least had their dogs on a leash. Always a good practice for being on the beach with other animals, but there it is. Okay, so I had promised some tips for responsible marine mammal viewing, and I'm going to give them to you. So one thing is I wanted to share the Marine Mammal Center Rescue Hotline. This is the main dispatch number for Sausalito. Currently with COVID, they don't always have folks picking up the line at Morro Bay. So I'm providing the main one. And if you say where you are, they can patch you in to the folks at Morro Bay. But this is where they've asked that we report any issues with marine mammals that we're concerned about at the moment. So I'm sharing that hotline with you. But good rule of thumb, everyone always asks for a distance, and it's really hard to give you a number. But based on those otter data, on average, the ideal thing is to enjoy these animals from a healthy distance of 50 meters or 150 feet. Now, the way to really tell is if the animal looks at you, you are too close. So for example, in the picture I have showing, although this is adorable, whoever is taking this picture is too close to these otters because they are alert and they are aware. And this may even be causing a little bit of spike in cortisol at this point. Animals are being vigilant. They notice you. At that point, that's when you should alter your behavior before you further alter their behavior. So this is the absolute rule of thumb. But if you want to be extra safe and just really try to ensure that you're not going to cause any disturbance to animals, a nice distance with some binoculars or a spotting scope are the best way to go. But the other thing is to avoid approaching or chasing the animals. So for example, in the water in a kayak with otters, the best way to get a nice view of the otters is to go past them parallel instead of going straight towards them, and certainly avoiding encircling them, at which point they might feel trapped. So if you go parallel to them, they see you as less of a threat. They're much less likely to be disturbed. And it's possible that you might even be able to get a little closer than that 50 meters without disturbing them. But you can cause a disturbance even at this distance if you're approaching them straight on, because the animals will take notice of something coming towards them as opposed to something going past them. So one important thing is if you avoid approaching the animals, but instead just try to go past them and appreciate them from that safe distance, you're less likely to cause a disturbance to them. And I hope this goes without saying, but anytime you're near marine mammals, always good to keep the kids close. to you and not to the mammal, and dogs on a leash, just to prevent any sort of negative interactions there. Where, I mean, that thankfully that one dog was on a leash. It could have actually gotten hurt if it had reacted in a different way and maybe ended up going towards that seal instead of away from it. And another way that you can always help out is to share your knowledge. You're here because you were really interested in learning more about this. And it's so great to share these tidbits with people, because a lot of times, and we were discussing this at the beginning before we all started this talk, folks just don't really know what the effects of human disturbance are on marine mammals. And when they understand that, then they will be more vigilant, more careful, more mindful of their actions when they're around these animals, because we want to be able to not cause these animals harm, enjoy them in their natural environment. So I want to show you this one video because it's easy to show lots of examples of what not to do when viewing marine mammals. And I have this fun video of what to do, but it's on YouTube. So I need to stop sharing briefly and go to YouTube instead. So bear with me while I do that. Hang on. Now I have to find the correct window. I think I found it. And while we're here, let me make sure I have the computer sounds on. Okay, so I want to share this example. This is my grad student, Kate, on a field trip about wildlife stewardship for my class, and an otter approached her kayak. And what she's doing here is gently discouraging the otter from climbing up. And that is the way to do it. What we want to do is not encourage these animals to join us on our kayaks. To be frank, otters are sometimes vicious creatures, and they definitely have some serious teeth in there. They can tear open a crab with just those teeth alone. So the right thing to do is not to shove the animal, but she tried to use her oar as a barrier and then sort of gave it a nudge to discourage it from climbing up. All right, I'm going to jump back to that PowerPoint one last time. We were here. I think that's actually it, but I wanted to share this cute picture of an elephant seal weanling, and I'm ready to take your questions.